In the spring of 1941, inside the cavernous factory halls of Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, a group of engineers stood over a machine so large and so heavy that many of them quietly wondered whether it could ever leave the ground. The prototype was called the XP-47B, and at first glance it looked less like a fighter and more like an armored bank vault with wings. It weighed over 7 tons fully loaded, nearly twice as much as the P-40s and Spitfires then fighting in Europe, and at its nose sat a monstrous Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine so powerful it required a 12-foot propeller just to convert its torque into useful thrust. Test pilot Gilmore C. Smith walked around the prototype on the morning of its first high-speed run, tapping the armor plates that lined the cockpit tub, the bullet-resistant windscreen, and the thick firewalls surrounding the engine. "Feels like I'm flying a safe," he muttered, but there was admiration in his voice. He knew this machine wasn't built for elegance, it was built to survive. When the Double Wasp erupted to life for the first time, the entire hangar vibrated. Mechanics stepped back as the propeller formed a shimmering disk, its roar drowning conversation and rattling metal tools. The XP-47B began to roll, gathering speed down the runway, its wheels digging into the tarmac as if resisting the idea of flight. And then, with a final surge, the massive aircraft lifted into the sky. 30 minutes later, Smith landed with a grin. "It flies," he said simply. The men around him cheered. The Air Corps had doubted Republic, had said no aircraft that heavy could dogfight, but the engineers had other ideas. The design philosophy behind the Thunderbolt was unlike any other fighter of the era. The United States Army Air Forces wanted a machine that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, absorb punishment, deliver firepower, and bring its pilots home even when shot to pieces. To make that possible, Republic's engineers built the XP-47B like a tank. A 14-millimeter steel plate protected the pilot's back. Additional armor surrounded the oil cooler and fuel pumps. The self-sealing fuel tanks, layered with vulcanized rubber, could be punctured by machine gun fire and still close themselves within minutes. Most importantly, the radial engine itself acted as a massive shield. Unlike liquid-cooled inline engines, such as the Merlin, which could be killed by a single rifle bullet to the coolant system, the Double Wasp could lose cylinders and keep running. It was the perfect engine for a fighter expected to fly through flak and come out alive. Even in testing, the Thunderbolt showed hints of what it would become. When Smith took the prototype into a steep dive, the aircraft accelerated past 480 miles per hour, buffeting violently but holding together even as the wings screamed in protest. Early test reports described her as sluggish in climb, magnificent in dive, superbly stable at high speed. Engineers refined the design through 1942, enlarging the turbocharger, lengthening the fuselage, and installing 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, the heaviest armament of any American fighter at the time. The improved version, the P-47C, rolled off the line in early 1943, soon followed by the even more formidable P-47D, which became the dominant model in Europe. But not everyone believed in the Thunderbolt at first. Newly assigned pilots in the States looked at the hulking aircraft and groaned. "She's a tractor with wings," one trainee said. They struggled with the long takeoff runs and heavy controls, cursing the airplane's sheer mass. Yet instructors insisted the weight was not a curse, but a promise. "The Jug will keep you alive," veterans said, using the nickname that would define the aircraft forever. "She may not dance like a Spitfire, but she'll get you home." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the air war over Europe was intensifying. The 8th Air Force was sending unescorted B-17s and B-24s deep into Germany, and the losses were brutal. What the bombers needed was a fighter that could go the distance, dive like a meteor, and take hits without becoming a fireball. The Thunderbolt was the answer if it could reach the fight in time. In March 1943, the first shipment of P-47Cs arrived in England, assigned to the 56th Fighter Group, commanded by the tough, analytical Hub Zemke. Zemke studied the plane's strengths and weaknesses and devised a new tactic that would soon become legendary: use altitude and weight to dominate in the dive. "We cannot turn with the Bf-109 or the FW-190, he told his pilots, "so we won't. We will strike from above and leave before they know we were there." The P-47s needed long-range radios installed, and their turbochargers had to be recalibrated to avoid choking in the damp English climate. But once tuned, they began flying escort missions over the channel, climbing steadily to meet the German fighters. On April 15, 1943, the P-47 flew its first combat mission over Europe, a sweep over Caen. The pilots returned grinning, exhilarated by the power of their new machines. Within weeks, Zemke's men were patrolling as far east as the Rhine. The Thunderbolt was proving its worth. Then came the reports that stunned even the designers. Pilots were returning from missions with dozens, sometimes hundreds of bullet holes in the wings and cowling, gashes from 20mm cannon shells, belts of 7.92mm rounds stitched across the fuselage, and yet the plane still flew. A P-47D from the 78th Fighter Group returned in May 1943 with over 150 holes, an oil line severed and half a cylinder missing, but the pilot survived. Zemke walked around the wrecked machine, running his hand across the torn metal. "That," he said, "is why we fly this airplane." By mid-1943, the Thunderbolt had earned its reputation. Heavy, rugged, unstoppable. The men who flew it began to trust the armor more than they trusted luck. They learned that the Jug didn't care how many bullets it took. As long as the pilot kept his nerve, the machine would bring him home. And in the skies above Europe, where survival often came down to inches and seconds, that promise was worth more than speed, more than beauty, more than any myth told by other fighter pilots. The P-47 was built to endure. And soon, as the war pushed into France and beyond, it would be tested in ways even its creators had never imagined. When the first Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group arrived at RAF King's Cliff in the spring of 1943, England was still wrapped in the gray chill of early April. The field soaked with rain and the air crawling with exhaust from trains and trucks feeding the 8th Air Force. The pilots of Zemke's Wolfpack gathered around their new aircraft with mixed expressions. Some impressed by its size, others quietly horrified. The P-47 dwarfed every other Allied fighter on the field. Parked beside a Spitfire Mark IX, it looked like an armored brawler standing next to a fencer. "Does it really fly with all that weight?" one pilot murmured. The crew chief next to him smirked. "Sir, it doesn't just fly, it refuses to die." The first combat escort missions revealed the truth quickly. The Thunderbolt was indeed slow to climb. German FW-190A4s and Bf-109G6s could spiral upward far more quickly, and the Luftwaffe pilots took advantage, diving from the sun to attack from above. But once the P-47 reached altitude and leveled off at 25,000 feet, the double Wasp roared like an unleashed animal. In level flight, it was fast, far faster than its shape suggested. And in a dive, it was unmatched. Pilots discovered that when they pushed the nose over and rolled into a steep plunge, the Thunderbolt could hit 500 miles per hour without falling apart, streaking past German fighters who dared not follow for fear their wings would rip off. The Wolfpack began using this to deadly effect. Boom and zoom tactics, strikes from above, break the attack, climb again. The Thunderbolt's baptism of fire came over Caen on April 15, 1943. The mission was routine, fighter sweep ahead of the bombers, but the Luftwaffe was waiting. A swarm of FW-190s slashed into the American formation, cannons flashing. Captain Frank Euler felt his Thunderbolt shudder as shells slammed into his left wing. His cockpit filled with smoke, yet the aircraft kept flying. Oil pressure dipped, then steadied. He rolled inverted, dove hard to escape, and found that despite the damage, the controls still responded. He limped home across the channel, leaving a black smoke trail all the way to the coast. Inspectors counted more than 55 holes in his machine. Euler climbed down from the cockpit, knees shaking, and said only, "If I'd been in a P-38, I'd be dead." That same month, Francis Gabi Grabowski, a young Polish-American pilot with sharp instincts and a sharper tongue, made his first real test of the plane's toughness. On a mission over France, his P-47 was hit repeatedly by 20mm cannon fire. A round punched through the cowling, shredding the ignition wires. Another ricocheted off the armor plate behind his seat. A third tore into the right wing root. Grabowski lost turbocharger control and dropped out of formation. But the double Wasp coughed, belched black smoke, and kept going.
Grabowski glided the crippled aircraft for nearly 50 miles, coaxing power from what felt like a dying engine. When he finally landed at Manston, a ground crew sergeant stared at the wreck and muttered, "She's got no right to still be in one piece." Grabowski simply shrugged. She wanted to come home. The news spread quickly through the fighter command huts. The P-47 was nearly impossible to kill. Unlike the P-51 Mustang or P-38 Lightning, whose liquid-cooled engines could be disabled by a single rifle round to the radiator or coolant lines, the radial double wasp could lose cylinders entirely and continue running on the remaining power strokes. And the Thunderbolts designers had placed every vital system, oil cooler, intercooler doors, fuel lines, battery, oxygen bottles, behind thick aluminum and armor plating. It was a fortress with wings. Pilots found themselves doing things they would never try in other planes. They flew lower. They stayed in flak longer. They pressed attacks deeper into Germany before peeling away. They learned that 7.92mm rounds from German MG-17 machine guns barely scratched the surface. Even 20mm Minenschuss shells, the Luftwaffe's notorious high-explosive rounds, often detonated on the thick skin without penetrating the internal structure. A P-47 from the 4th Fighter Group returned after a sweep over Rouen with a 20mm shell lodged in the turbocharger duct, unexploded. The ground crew removed it with pliers. The pilot fainted when he saw it. By summer 1943, the Luftwaffe had taken notice. German pilots began referring to the Thunderbolt as their Eisenhund, the iron dog, because it absorbed punishment like a chained beast refusing to die. One FW-190 pilot, captured after bailing out, reportedly said, "The big American fighter, we shoot and shoot, but it only smokes and keeps coming." Meanwhile, at Kingscliff and Hallisworth, mechanics grew accustomed to sights that would astonish later generations. Thunderbolts landing with flaps missing, stabilizers sheared halfway off, cylinders blown apart, and holes large enough to fit a man's fist through the fuselage. In the maintenance diaries of the 56th FG, one entry from July 1943 reads, "Aircraft P-47-D-2-RE, tail 427893, returned with 104 confirmed bullet punctures, engine losing oil. Pilot unharmed, aircraft repairable." Headquarters noted the pattern. The P-47 was suffering more hits than any other fighter, but losing fewer pilots. Colonel Hub Zemke summarized the truth in one sentence: "The design keeps them alive long enough to learn from their mistakes." By the fall of 1943, the pilots no longer joked about the Thunderbolt's size. They embraced it. They leaned on it. They trusted it. The weight that once felt like a burden now felt like a shield. In a sky where death often came from behind and without warning, the pilots of the 8th Air Force found comfort in the heavy armor wrapped around their fragile bodies. And as the bombers pushed deeper into Germany, the Thunderbolt was about to be tested in a new role, one that would turn the Jug from a tough escort fighter into the single most feared ground attack aircraft on the Western Front.
By the summer of 1944, the war had changed, and so had the Thunderbolt. No longer just an escort fighter, the P-47 had become the blunt instrument of the Allied advance. A machine born to destroy trains, convoys, tanks, flak towers, and anything unlucky enough to move beneath its wings. After D-Day on June 6, 1944, Thunderbolt groups shifted from the airfields of England to temporary advanced landing grounds carved out of the French countryside. Pilots now lived in tents, pitched beside fields of wheat and mud, engines rumbling before dawn as they launched into the smoke-filled skies over Normandy. With each mile the Allies pushed inland, the P-47s followed, hopping from one impromptu strip to another. A6 at Bouzeval, A8 at Picaville, A12 at Ligneiro. Each little more than a dirt strip scraped flat by bulldozers. The work was brutal. Thunderbolt pilots flew 3, sometimes 4 ground attack sorties a day, diving at treetop height into clouds of dust, mud, and flak. Their targets were the broken arteries of the German retreat, armored golems moving through the hedgerows, trains chugging toward Caen, supply trucks rushing toward Falaise. And the Luftwaffe, now shrinking, made the ground even deadlier. Because every German rifle, MG-42, and especially the 20mm flak-filled 38, pointed skyward whenever a Thunderbolt swooped low. For most fighters, flying that low was suicide. But the P-47 was not most fighters. Lieutenant Raymond Knight of the 379th Fighter Squadron discovered this on July 18, 1944. His flight attacked a convoy near Saint-Malo, diving from 3,000 feet into a storm of tracers. His Thunderbolt shuddered as rounds hammered the wings and fuselage. One shell tore through the left wing root, another burst against the armor behind his seat, spraying fragments across the cockpit. Knight held the dive, released his bombs, and yanked the Jug back into the sky. On landing, the crew counted over 200 holes in the aircraft. The wings looked like Swiss cheese. But Knight walked away unscratched. "She's ugly, but God, she's loyal," he said, patting the battered fuselage. The reason was simple and brilliantly engineered. Most fighters of the era protected the pilot with a single armor plate. The P-47 surrounded him with a curved armored tub, 8 to 12 millimeters thick. The fuel tanks were self-sealing and placed low in the fuselage where hits were less likely. The turbocharger ducting ran along the belly in a thick armored channel. And the engine, that massive R2800, was a guardian angel of steel. A liquid-cooled engine like the Merlin in the Mustang could be destroyed by one bullet cutting a coolant line. A radial engine could keep operating even with an entire cylinder destroyed, shrugging off damage that would kill any inline power plant. As one pilot put it, the Germans had to shoot the Jug until they ran out of ammunition or patience. Nowhere was this truer than in the battles around Caen, Saint-Lô, and the Falaise Gap. Thunderbolt pilots dove so low that branches sometimes lodged in their radiators. They came back with flaps missing, elevator cables frayed, canopies cracked. One P-47 from the 365th Fighter Group returned with its right horizontal stabilizer nearly severed, held on by little more than torn metal, and still the pilot survived the landing. The German commanders wrote bitter reports about the Thunderbolt's survivability. Oberstleutnant Hans von Luch noted in his diary during the retreat from Falaise, "The large American fighter would descend over our columns through fire so dense no other aircraft could endure it. Yet it came again and again, as if immune." Allied ground troops began calling the P-47 the tank buster, though its bombs and rockets did most of the heavy lifting. Still, the plane's ruggedness made it possible. A Mustang hit by flak might catch fire. A P-47 hit by the same round might lose a panel, leak oil, and keep flying another 100 miles. In the 29th Tactical Air Command, more than 70% of pilots hit by ground fire survived, an astonishing statistic attributed directly to the P-47's armor and engine design. The psychological effect was equally real. Thunderbolt pilots walked to their planes with a confidence bordering on defiance. They knew that flying low-level attack missions over Normandy or Brittany was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. But they also knew that they sat inside the toughest single-engine aircraft ever built. A pilot named Lieutenant Joe Laughlin summed it up after surviving a crash landing in a wheat field with his engine on fire and control cables half shredded. "If I'd been in anything else, I wouldn't be telling you this." By September 1944, the Allies pushed beyond the Seine into Belgium. Thunderbolts roared over columns near Mons and Brussels, shredding retreating Wehrmacht formations. Every landing strip became a graveyard of battered Jugs, patched with new aluminum panels, bullet holes circled in chalk, oil leaks marked with red paint. Engines were swapped daily. Crews worked until dawn. But the pilots kept flying, because the aircraft kept returning, even when logic said they shouldn't. The Thunderbolt had become more than a machine. It was a shield, a fortress in the sky. The men who flew it now understood its purpose. Not elegance, not speed, not perfect maneuverability, but survival. Survival to complete the mission. Survival to fly again the next morning. Survival to see the war's end. And as the Allies prepared to cross into Germany, they knew they would need that shield more than ever, because the flak fields east of the Rhine were waiting. And the Thunderbolt was about to face the most intense anti-aircraft fire of the entire war. By the time autumn settled over Western Europe in late 1944, the Thunderbolt had become a familiar, dreaded presence in German skies. As Allied armies closed in on the Reich's borders, the P-47's mission shifted again, from breaking the German retreat in Normandy to smashing the armored heart of the Wehrmacht inside its own homeland. The pilots of the Ninth Air Force now flew into a world of steel, fire, and black smoke where every river line, rail junction, and crossroads sprouted flat guns like dark weeds. On the eve of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Thunderbolts were hitting rail yards in Koblenz, troop concentrations in Aachen, and armored convoys creeping through the Ardennes. Germany was fighting with desperation, and the skies were thick with the fire of the 88mm flak-36, the rapid bursts of 20mm flak-Vierling 38, and the chattering arcs of MG-42s. Many pilots later swore the air itself seemed filled with metal. Normally, no pilot would dare dive into such chaos, but the P-47 made it possible. The records from this period are astonishing. Jugs routinely returned with 60, 80, even 120 holes torn through their wings and fuselage. One aircraft of the 365th Fighter Group, flying support around Bastogne, limped home with more than 200 confirmed bullet strikes, a grotesque pattern of shredded aluminum and torn fabric, but the pilot stepped out without a scratch. The crew chief stared at the wrecked machine like a man seeing a ghost. "She shouldn't be here," he whispered, "but she is." Such scenes became routine during the winter of 1944-45. Thunderbolts operated in snowstorms, fog, and freezing rain, diving through cloud breaks to strike German armor attempting to break through the Ardennes. Every village hit a flak trap. Every forest clearing held a half-track with quad 20s waiting for a silhouette in the sky. Yet the armored skin of the Jug, the radial engine with its thick front cylinders, and the self-sealing fuel tanks kept pilots alive. The Luftwaffe, now fractured and outnumbered, shifted to defense. But even when German fighters did rise, Bf-109 G-14s or the final FW-190 A-8s, they quickly learned not to waste ammunition on the Thunderbolts' armored front. A Luftwaffe report intercepted by Allied intelligence in January 1945 described the aircraft bluntly. American P-47 requires sustained fire. Aim for tail surfaces or canopy. Engine and fuselage frequently resist 20mm shells. Even German ace Erich Rudorfer commented after the war, "The Thunderbolt was huge. We fired at its front and it kept coming. It was not pleasant." On the Allied side, the 56th, 78th, 358th, and 362nd Fighter Groups tore across Germany in near-constant sorties. They strafed trains in the Ruhr Valley, bombed tank depots, and destroyed thousands of trucks trying to reinforce the Western Front. The Jug thrived in this brutal work. Its thick wings held heavy bombs, 500-pounders, even 1,000-pounders, and its 8.5 caliber Brownings ripped through locomotives and armored cars with frightening reliability. Pilots learned to trust the aircraft with their lives. Captain Robert S. Johnson, already a legend by 1944, survived dozens of missions with flak holes peppering his machine. Once his P-47 returned with half the rudder gone, both wing roots torn open, and the oil pressure near zero. He still managed to land. Any other plane would have folded like paper, he said afterward. The Jug just shrugged. During the bulge, the aircraft's survivability reached mythic status. On December 24, 1944, Lieutenant Richard M. Mills of the 365th Fighter Group was hit by flak near Howe Falls. His P-47 shook violently, oxygen lines severed, canopy cracked, electrical system failing. He descended to treetop level, flying half-blind through snow squalls. When he crossed friendly lines, he realized his landing gear wouldn't deploy. He belly landed in a snowy field. The Jug skidded 100 yards, stopped, and he climbed out untouched. His crew counted 187 holes in the fuselage, wings, and tail. The aircraft was scrapped. Mills was back in the air 2 days later. Stories like this circulated in every mess tent. Some pilots said the Jug must have been welded from battleship armor. Others joked that Republic had built it with leftover train parts. A sergeant in the 362nd put it simply, that airplane just doesn't know how to die. German flak crews, exhausted and freezing in the winter mud, learned to fear the deep-throated growl of a Thunderbolt engine overhead. When a flight of Jugs dived, the ground shook. Fuel trucks exploded, tanks burst apart, rail cars split like tin cans. But just as terrifying was watching that same aircraft pull up through black clouds of shrapnel and keep climbing, riddled but alive. By early 1945, as Allied forces pushed toward the Rhine,
The Thunderbolts' reputation was sealed. It was not the sleekest fighter, not the fastest climber, but it was the one that brought men home, again and again, even when it shouldn't have. Pilots of the 9th Air Force often gathered around a returned Jug, running their fingers across fresh holes in the skin, sometimes dozens in a single square yard. "How many hit you today?" one would ask. "Enough," the pilot would answer. And he would smile because he had lived. The P-47 was more than a weapon now. It was a companion in survival, a beast of steel and fire that faced down the most vicious air defenses in the world and refused to break. And as the war neared the end, its pilots knew one truth with absolute certainty: they would not have survived in anything else.
When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the airfields of the 8th and 9th Air Forces were littered with the battered, oil-stained bodies of the machines that had carried victory on their wings. Among them, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood alone, massive, scarred, and unmistakable. Some sat with patched fuselages dull under the spring sun. Others rested on their bellies, landing gear shot away months earlier. And a few still bore the chalk marks of maintenance crews counting bullet holes: 70, 120, 180, sometimes more than 200. Numbers that seemed more like statistics from artillery duels than fighter missions. By the war's end, 15,683 P-47s had rolled off assembly lines, more than any other American fighter. They had flown over 750,000 sorties, destroyed 86,000 ground targets, and earned a place as the single most effective fighter bomber of the European theater. But for the men who flew them, the Jugs' true legacy was measured not in bombs dropped or tanks destroyed, but in lives saved. Across Europe, letters began arriving at Republic Aviation's headquarters. Some were from young pilots still stationed in Germany. Others were from veterans just returned home, writing from porches and kitchen tables still unfamiliar after years of war. All shared a single message: "I am alive because of your airplane." One letter, written by a pilot of the 362nd Fighter Group, read, "I took a 20mm shell in the nose, another in the wing, and a burst across the belly tank. Everything that should have killed me did not. I landed with fuel leaking, hydraulics gone, and half an aileron missing. My crew chief cried when he saw the damage. If I'd been in anything else, my parents would be receiving a different letter." Ground crews, too, recognized what the Thunderbolt had done. They had spent long nights welding torn metal, replacing shot-out cylinders, and hammering bent panels back into shape. They knew which aircraft came home riddled with holes and which ones burned in the fields. They saw the difference between machines that folded under fire and machines that shrugged it off, and nothing shrugged like the Jug. One crew chief later wrote, "Working on a P-47 was like working on a battleship. Everything was overbuilt, everything was rugged, and everything mattered." Even decades later, veterans would gather at reunions and speak not first of victories, but of survivals. They recalled the smell of oil in a burning cockpit, the scream of flak tearing through aluminum, the shudder of the airframe as cannon shells slammed into the wings. They remembered glancing at fuel gauges and feeling hope because the tank was self-sealing, watching oil pressure dip and rise again because the double wasp refused to quit, hearing the engine cough but never die, even with cylinders blown open. Stories accumulated like myths, but each one was true. One P-47 returned to base with 9 cylinders dead and the propeller locked at half pitch. Another came home with its turbo supercharger completely severed, the ducting hanging like broken ribs. A pilot from the 373rd Fighter Group limped 70 miles back to base with a 3-foot hole in the right wing and a missing flap. He later said, "I wasn't flying her, she was carrying me." After the war, the Thunderbolt served in the Air National Guard and in foreign air forces from France to Brazil. But the jet age was coming, and by the early 1950s, the last Jugs were retired. Many were scrapped, flattened under hydraulic presses, or sold for scrap aluminum. Yet a few survived, restored, repainted, displayed in museums across America. Visitors today see the hulking fuselage and the massive radial engine and marvel that such a machine ever flew. But only those who know the stories understand what they are really looking at. Not a relic, not a curiosity. A miracle of engineering, one that protected thousands of young men in the most hostile skies on Earth. In the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, a preserved P-47D sits beneath soft light, its metal skin polished but still bearing faint scars. A small plaque beside it lists specifications:
weight, horsepower, armament. But that dry list can never convey what the aircraft truly meant. To understand, you must stand close enough to see the thickness of the armor behind the cockpit. You must trace the lines of the engine cowling with your eyes and imagine it absorbing a storm of bullets meant for the man inside. You must picture what it looked like returning from a mission, smoke trailing, panels flapping, coals punched clean through the wings, yet still alive, still flying, still bringing its pilot home. One of the last surviving Thunderbolt aces in an interview from the 1980s was asked how he remembered the aircraft. He paused for a long time, his eyes narrowing as if trying to see across the decades of distance. Then he said, "You don't remember a machine like that. You remember what it did. You remember climbing out after a mission, touching the skin, feeling the heat, and knowing it took everything they threw at you. And you're standing there because it refused to let you die." That is the Thunderbolts' legacy. Not just a record of kills or sorties, but a bond etched in steel and fire. A promise fulfilled again and again over France, Belgium, and Germany. A testament that in the most violent chapter of human history, survival could be engineered, courage could be reinforced, and a young man's life could depend on the stubborn, unbreakable heart of a machine built to endure the impossible.